bit is socketservertcl, but you can click along with me or look at it on your phone. And this is not a lot of code, so we'll get right into it. Okay, so to explain this, the first thing I did is I did a really high-res, high-performance trace of the system operating, and here we can see it in the core. You have the server, he's up there in the corner, kind of looks like a flower. Next to him is a FIFO. Here it comes, there's a socket. He throws it in the FIFO. Oh, the worker wakes up with an event, and then he goes and sends his data out, and I guess that's a killer robot and a flight track and a deer. I don't know, I just traced it. Okay. TCP server programming. These are the calls. Who's familiar? Raise your hand. Great. Okay, if you're not familiar, enjoy the talk. So what do we do? Socket creates a socket, gives you an in. Bind assigns the address 10.0.1. whatever. Yeah, I can't see my stuff. Don't turn off. Listen actually tells the operating system we want to advertise and have the possibility of getting connections. And accept, actually get a connection. These are the calls we have. Okay, so how do we create worker processes, additional threads to process data for specific connections? And this is exactly what this is all about. This is about how to do pre-forking or how to do any kind of forking. So, classic, in the Stevens book, chapter 1, socket, bind, listen, accept, fork, and read and write to the client, right? That is the first program you write. And then you're like, well, after I fork, I got to start up, and that's slow. So I don't want to do that. I want to pre-fork. So then we end up with the next recipe. Socket, bind, listen, fork, accept, then process the client, right? Now what happens is when we listen and then we fork, every process from that fork now has the listening FD and it can accept. And if you have a good modern UNIX, which they all are now, they can all do this. If you have some embedded UNIX, it might not be able to do this, right? Depending on its fork. But all modern UNIXs will schedule the fork over the sockets. This works perfectly well in Tcl. If you say socket server, and you say fork, your callbacks will be called. And it will distribute the load over your forks. Okay? Now, we have another setting that's in the operating system, which is this SO reuse support. We're all fairly familiar with SO reuse adder. This one says, let me use the port over again, because I could have forked it and it worked. Why don't you let me use it? So it can do it, right? Now what we have is the fork is in the very front, and we can do socket, bind, listen, accept in separate processes, right? So that's why I put exec on there. It could be fork or exec, it doesn't matter. And just about every modern operating system will do this also, okay? So now we have 1, 2, 3 ways to make workers process work for client applications, right? Okay, so SO reuse port is in Tcl, it's tip 465, okay? So one of the things I did is I went through these different ways of doing this to try to see which way would work well for FlightAware's case, right? Okay, so the OS has control with multiple listening FDs. This is it. How many connections will go to a particular socket or process is not specified. You know, what the queue depth will be is not specified. It's all experimental. And I was actually kind of excited about SO reuse port because it is very good, and it's actually used by Cloudflare to get massive scale. But it is very dependent on your Linux configuration. As a matter of fact, if you don't have independent I/O channels set up on your network card, you will not get their scale. So you had to have a million settings, you had to have set just right to get it to scale. And one of the things is it uses the IP addresses to hash the connections and distribute them. We don't have thousands of IP addresses, so the hashing algorithm gave us a scaling of about 8. No good. So what do? How do we get the classic thread with multiple workers, right? Well, how does Apache do this? Well, they do pre-forking. They have lock to avoid load, to have all these people waking up and doing accept, right? Another way of doing it is to use a proxy or a broker with TCP. So you have one socket that receives data. You open up another socket to a worker and you copy those bytes down and proxy for them. And that's actually how the FlightAware servers worked for many years. And it's a proven recipe, but you're copying the bytes and you have a queuing there, right? Then finally, there's this weird thing called SCM writes. Okay? So who's heard of SCM writes? There you go. See, this has been in UNIX forever. And all it is for is this. And Apache has a mod for this, and this is what socketservertcl is actually giving you. You can send a control message, which is just a message with a header, on a sole socket that lets you send a file descriptor to a different process. And since that could be a major security issue, has to be a sole socket, which is pretty much dictated, it has to be after a fork. So whatever rights you had before the fork, you have after the fork. And this thing has been there forever, and this is its sole purpose, is to pass a file descriptor from, and specifically a socket, from one process to another process. So we need to get at that.
Just FYI, Windows also has that feature.
Yeah, good. See, I didn't know that because I don't even have a Windows machine to build my extension on. So if anyone wants to donate a Windows machine to me, I will port my extension to Windows.
It's a major underpinning for the same reason for how they scale up servers. And they're going to do kernel switching.
Okay, so here we go. socketservertcl is literally an extension that is just designed to get you access to this SCM writes C call. And what we can do then is we can pass the tcl socket across a fork, right? So now, you just look at a little bit of code, it's super tiny. So we want to read from the bottom up, so wait forever, make a fork, so you can see we just do a fork, and then after we fork, we have the first call, which is the socket server socket client, and then you have to give it your accept handler, your callback, right? And this is sort of analogous to the regular tcl socket listen, right? Then above that, we have the handle accept that we were going to do for the socket server, right? And you'll see all it does is create a file event on that socket to actually do all the I/O. So what I discovered when I wrote this is my first test program didn't have file event. It worked. And then as I sent more and more data, it worked. And then when we put it in production, it didn't work. Because they sent a lot of data. Really, really, really big strings. And the really, really, really big strings would get us, without the events, the background I/O that was doing the writing didn't work. So the actual code, this code is exactly the same as your normal socket code would be. So what the thing is if you wrote a program with tcl socket, a single thread server, you make it a socket server without having to kind of rewrite your tcl, because the actual event handler that you already have for the socket call would plug in right here. The only difference is we do one at a time. So when you get to the bottom, like an after event, you have to resubscribe to get the next socket sent to you. So it doesn't queue any sockets to a particular worker. The worker gets one, does his work. If he doesn't come back to get another one, he doesn't get another. They're queued in the socket server. And there is a queue. They're in the pipeline. Okay, any questions? Yeah.
Did you send the master file descriptor to all of the clients, all of the workers?
we could send any file descriptor and socket. We could send them any socket, right? So we could send that socket and they could accept, right? Yep.
Which TCP protocols is this used for?
What do you mean?
Are you using it for HTTP or are you using it for other protocols? What are you actually using to talk to?
No, we do it right on top of TCP, so we don't have another protocol. So it's not like HTTP, it's just our text protocol. It's not really a protocol. It's a protocol.
So it's an open stream.
It's a stream of bytes, right? Okay, now we're going to go into corporate mode to balance out my first slide, so everyone shield your eyes. Corporate mode. Oh! Here's the actual sequence diagram of what's really going on. Help! Okay, so if you're not familiar with sequence diagrams, our actors are at the top and the bottom, these boxes. And since it's corporate, all we have is boxes. It doesn't have circles. And the lines are representing the connection points where the events go, right? So what happens is you start your program and you fork and you get your client socket guy. Then he's got to register the callback to actually receive sockets. And then what happens is the server's going to set up the actual socket and start doing accepts. It's going to use the send message call. The UNIX system call is the same as write, but you got to write a message, right? So you give it the control properties and puts it in the FIFO. And then in the FIFO, you're getting a regular Tcl file event, waking you up, and you pull out the socket with receive message, pass it back to your handler, do what you need to do, and then at the end, you have to re-register to get the next one. Now, unlike Apache that says one big negative, which could be enhanced, is that all of the workers are going to get that Tcl'2017 event. Because the operating system doesn't know what's going on, and the file's readable. They're all going to get woken up. Only one of them is going to get to actually pull the message out. Apache solves this with a lock. So they check the lock. If they have the lock, they actually do the accept. So Tcl socket server just says, you know what? The machine's not that loaded. It doesn't really matter. It's almost you can almost not measure the overhead of that. And we don't have thousands and thousands of connections. This would not be good for trying to win a 10K server contest. You would not win. You would lose. You would lose badly. So that's it. Any questions? It's all on GitHub, some of the flight aware. All right, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Okay.